So I've been sitting here reflecting about how love and loss and leadership can sometimes come together, how they intertwine sometimes. And I realized that some years don't come to move you forward in obvious ways that the world might expect. Rather, they come to steady you quietly, silently behind the scenes in a way that the world may not always see. And for me, 2025 was that kind of year. It was a year that, it was not a year that I would describe through milestones or achievements as such. But it was a year where a lot of important things happened, quietly behind the scenes, beneath the surface. And I just want to take a few minutes to reflect on that. Not to explain myself, but rather to give context, in a sense, to my experiences in 2025, to give context to what shaped me in that season of my life. And this reflection isn't about productivity, it's not about output. Rather, it's about recognizing what happens or what can happen when, life asks you or me to slow down and to respond differently. Now, if you've ever lived through a season of life where growth didn't look all that impressive or all that obvious, but still felt really significant, then you may recognize some of what I'm about to share. I've been thinking about care, responsibility, and love. In 2025, my beloved mother became critically ill. And towards the end, she was on palliative care. She came to live with me, and from that point on, everything had to be recalibrated to prioritize her and her well-being. And so for me, time had to become more deliberate. Energy had to be managed carefully. And my priorities, they had to become clearer because I had to prioritize her above all else. She was 100% dependent on me at a point, being 100% dependent on oxygen. And so I realized quickly that caregiving is rarely described as leadership. But then it requires many of the same qualities, I realized, that leadership requires. Qualities like presence, patience, responsibility, and discernment. There were no big moments as such that I can point to in 2024. Well, that's wrong, but we'll come to that later. But on a daily basis, I had to make daily decisions to be available, to show up, to pay attention, to prioritize somebody else's well-being in place of mine. And in that season, one of the things I learned was that love doesn't always look dramatic or expressive. Sometimes it just looks like consistency. Just being consistent, just being there, right? Being available. And that consistency really, truly matters, especially for someone who was in the position that my mother was in the last year of her life. And so later that year, my mom passed away, sadly, unfortunately, and then grief hit. Now, grief doesn't arrive with instructions. It doesn't arrive with a manual that you can follow. It is not linear. It can change your experience of time, urgency, and ambition, because some days you just want to sit still and do nothing and just grieve and just think of your loved one that you've lost. And so I didn't stop working. I didn't fully disengage from life as such, but I did turn inward a lot in 2025. I became more reflective. I became more selective of what I gave my time to. And I became more aware of what actually deserved my energy and what did not deserve my energy. And that season taught me that strength doesn't always mean pushing through, striving. being busy, pulling off projects, announcing, launching. That's not strength, not all of the time. Sometimes it means allowing yourself to pause, right? To acknowledge what has changed or what needs to change. And leadership, right? Operating in leadership during a private season of life, during a trying season of life, can be challenging. What many people don't see is that leadership doesn't stop when life becomes personal or when life becomes challenging. Leadership doesn't stop. If anything, you need it in that season more than any time else. Now, during that year, 2025, last year, I was also co-founding G Woman Media, a woman-centered media organization, created to amplify women's voices and vision and visibility and value. That work continued in the time that I was looking after my mom, and it still continues, but my relationship to that work changed. It almost became like a lifeline. Those were the moments when I could steal 30 minutes or 20 minutes to go into an executive meeting and feel so empowered. I became intentional about where I placed my focus. And this was one of the places, building G Woman Media was one of the places where I placed my focus. I became interested not in speed, but rather in alignment. For me, giving birth to this company, co-creating, co-building, co-founding this company became, alignment. And it reinforced something that I've come to believe in very deeply, is that leadership is never about momentum. It's never about momentum. It's not even about volume either. It's about significance. It's about judgment, knowing when to act and knowing when to hold back, knowing when to restrain, even knowing when to say no to something. And so some of what 2025 taught me is that it stripped away, it helped me to strip away a lot of unnecessary urgency, unnecessary, that need, that fever, that need to be busy, producing things, that sometimes didn't really matter. Rather, I took care of what actually mattered, and what I had previously had to give attention to out of habit had to then take a back seat. So 2025 reminded me that not every year is meant for, expansion and visibility per se, in that sense of the word. Some years are about stabilizing what already exists. Of course, some years are about giving birth, to what does not exist but needs to. About strengthening those parts of you that will need to carry more weight later. And so trust me, I learned a whole lot about foundations in 2025. And I've come to understand that a foundation isn't something that you build after life becomes calm and settled. When, as they say, all the ducks come home to roost and all the ducks are lined up or whatever. No, it is what life builds inside of you, within you, who you become when things are uncertain. That's foundation. That's the greatest foundation. Because a foundation is what remains when urgency fades away. A foundation is what remains when the chaos, the madness, whatever it is, fades away. When external expectations go quiet. When you are left with just yourself, looking in the mirror, what do you see? When you are left with only what is essential, that essential thing has to be your foundation, your grounding. So for me, 2025 became a kind of foundational year for me because it changed how I relate to time, how I relate to purpose, and how I see responsibility, how I see service. Because in 2025, my service was not to the world, was not to followers or fans, but to my mother. And it helped me to prioritize depth over speed, integrity over appearance, and meaning over momentum, as I rightly should. And it reminded me that growth doesn't always look like movement, that sometimes growth looks like staying put, long enough to, long enough for something solid to form, or staying put long enough to do the work that has to be done, that needs to be done, that that has been placed in front of you to be done. So if you're listening to this, and if you're recognizing a season in your own life that has changed you quietly, or may be changing you quietly, I want you to hear this and hear it clearly. That season didn't delay you. It prepared you. And what was formed beneath the surface, it may seem like it's hidden, but it still matters. And it is still what will support the next season of your life, of your achievements. And trust me, it is what will hold whatever you're going to build next. And so in my next video, I'm going to share with you why I'm choosing now, to reintroduce myself. Why now? And what does this season represent for me? Those are some of the things that I will be discussing with you in future videos. But as I sign off, I want you to bear this in mind. Life sometimes is simple. Sometimes it needs to be non-performative. Because what? Some seasons of life, they shape you, but they shape you quietly behind the scenes.